Welcome to the FEMA's Public Assistance Program webinars presented by FEMA's Public Assistance Training Section. This is a recording of a live webinar.
This webinar that you've entered is where we'll be discussing Public Assistance Program overview. We will be discussing the program delivery model, how public assistance, that section of the larger Federal Emergency Management Agency, conducts the process of getting grants approved for federal assistance. Learning objectives.
We want to talk about the Public Assistance Program.
We're going to go over the program of public assistance, its authorities, your participants, and the organization, how it's put together, the building blocks of that program, who's eligible, how that's even conceived of, and then becoming familiar with the public assistance national workflow, those phases in which we're able to process grants through the tool known as Grants Manager and Grants Portal. And at the end of the session, we'll discuss where you can find additional resources to help you in your role within public assistance, helping our survivors of disasters.
First part we're going to discuss is the overview of that Public Assistance Program, where its authorities come from, who participates in it, and its actual organization. What is FEMA Public Assistance? And of course, we understand that FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, within that agency, our agency, we have different sections. Public Assistance, PA, is a program providing supplemental grants to the state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, SLTTs, state, local, tribal, and territorial, and certain types of PNPs, your private nonprofits. So communities can quickly respond to and recover from major disasters or emergencies. And when they say quickly, the idea here is that through the delivery model process, using Grants Manager and Grants Portal, we've got an efficient system that can be accurate. It can be tracked. Grants Manager and Grants Portal do act as a system of record. So more than one agency, more than one federal agency, right, we can share this information. We can have it put together. We can have our survivors of disasters able to jump in, following the process, having the resources available to get that documentation so that the federal government can process that grant and help our survivors recover. PA, Public Assistance, is the largest grant program within FEMA. And you can see right there, it takes up almost, half of the amount that's allocated here. $4.7 billion a year, 51% of all grants granted through FEMA. We've got PA, we've got IA, individual assistance. Difference being, families, individuals, as opposed to municipalities, schools, hospitals. Mitigation, really something that's been developing, growing, is getting more and more important as well. The Stafford Act, the authorities by which FEMA is able to, through public assistance, process those grants, allocate those funds, originated in the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, the Stafford Act. It was developed to authorize the president to administer federal assistance through the disaster declaration process. The executive branch, legally authorized to declare disasters. It's able to regulate the type and extent of public assistance reimbursement, and it provides that eligibility criteria and requirements, all in a transparent manner. By having it in law, by having it codified, you get from the Stafford Act is supplemented with a Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. Again, an authority that for public assistance governed by the rules set forth in Title 44 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. Parts 206 and 304, we're talking on, this is a thick old book, by the way. And those topics included in there, programs, administration, eligibility, costs, and contract procurement. Quick note, the idea of management costs. Grants process can actually reimburse entities for costs related to managing that disaster, the documentation itself. And the authorities, related specifically to eligibility, we've got the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, the PAPA G. Talking about that PAPA G, the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. How about that word, right? Compendium of most public assistance program policies. It does. It provides the overview of the program, the implementation, and gives you links to other publications and documents that provide additional process details, such as what's legal, what is related, deadlines, definitions of categories, how to classify certain damages, putting it together. It's not only a guide, it's a great review process. Executive orders, a executive order is something that a rule or order issued by the president to an executive branch of the government and having the force of law. FEMA's got to ensure federally funded public assistance disaster recovery projects comply with other agencies, like certain other laws, agencies such like we're talking the Environmental and Historic Preservation, EHP statutes, think endangered species, think archaeological historic areas that need to be at least mapped, understood, and different regulations and executive orders. They've got examples. 11988 floodplain management. If anybody here has been a site inspector or a program delivery manager, you understand the idea of the FEMA mapping done by the federal government that outlines where you've got floodplains, where you've got areas that could be flooded. Now we're moving into the idea of what the program delivery model is all about, how public assistance is able to process grants, the model. Key elements of that, in the development of it, FEMA has decided to try to simplify roles and responsibilities. In other words, put them together so everybody understands what they're doing within the model, within that delivery model, understands their role. And when they're talking about the cloud-based program, here we are. We use Grants Manager for FEMA employees, such as those site inspectors, those program delivery managers, PAGs, your public assistance group supervisors, even, say, IBDs, infrastructure branch directors, task force leaders, deputy IBDs, etc. Whereas the other side of the coin, Grants Portal, we've got the recipients, the applicants, tribal entities, territorial representatives, contractors, and when we're moving in and we're talking about how the phases go, you know, we've got phase 1, 2, 3, 4, moving on, getting these grants processed toward obligation, we've got the Consolidated Resource Center. Those centers, there's 4 of them. You know, we've got the West, we've got Central, we've got East, right there in Winchester, Virginia. Or the Atlantic, dealing with Puerto Rico. Well, those Consolidated Resource Centers are important because what they do is they actually can review the documentation, can review those costs. They develop the scope and costs associated with what was passed on to them through phase 2. So the participants themselves in the program, right, the non-FEMA participants, as I was saying, the recipient is an entity that receives a federal award directly from a federal award agency to carry out an activity. Feds talking to SLTTs, state, local, tribal, or territorial entities. Whereas the applicants, they're non-federal entities submitting an application for assistance under the recipient's federal award. So in other words, like think Oklahoma, right? Big state, lots of tribes in there. In fact, somebody was telling me a little known fact. Did you know that there are more native languages in Oklahoma than there are in Europe? Fun fact. Well, those tribes, in other words, usually as a sovereign nation, similar to a recipient. Whereas, say, a state in Oklahoma or a large university, they're under the umbrella of the recipient. In other words, the recipient gets the funding finally and then passes it on to the applicant after the applicant has been registered with that recipient. A subrecipient, very similar to those applicants, is an applicant that has received a subaward from a recipient. We spoke earlier a little bit about all the different FEMA participants that we have. We've got your IBD, your infrastructure branch directors, your PAGs, public assistance group supervisors, those task force leaders. You've got a program delivery manager. You also have a site inspector task force leader. You've got program delivery managers. You've got site inspectors. You also have Consolidated Resource Center specialists. It's a great little flow chart, right? Talking about the structure itself. So an IBD has answering to them, these groups, and it goes down through that same process. You know, it's often because it's an operational structure. A lot of people think of it as a hierarchy. Not necessarily that strong an analogy. This is a team structure. You can't work together as a team without a little bit of structure. A site inspector is going to get instructions, going to get their work orders most likely assigned or discussed by a task force leader. A task force leader, site inspector, got a lot of that information, had discussions with the program delivery manager about the damages that will be inspected. Before the program delivery manager put together some of those work order requests, they probably talked to their task force leader, who is in touch with a public assistance group supervisor, who was talking with all of these parts of the team, including the infrastructure branch director. And remember, the IBD can also have a deputy, just as public assistance group supervisor has a deputy. But working together as a team, they're working for the most part to get these programs, to get these damages put into projects, and depending on what the disaster involved, right? You've got different types of events, some related to floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, fires, whatever that may be, is going to require a different type of emphasis, like how it's put together. A fire is going to damage buildings much differently than a flood is going to damage it. So how these things are put together, how the event is structured, is a team effort. But that program delivery manager, pretty central to the whole process. They speak with all of these people, just as all of these people are also talking with each other. The more you communicate, the more you understand. And Grants Manager, Grants Portal does exist as a tool by which they can kind of structure a lot of this, the process steps. And here we're talking about the idea of the Consolidated Resource Centers. 4 CRCs, they're located throughout it. We've got out in the west, Sacramento, over here in the central, Denton, and then east, Winchester, and then Atlantic, Puerto Rico. All projects, once they have their damages described, have their dimensions put together, right? DDD, damage description and dimension, have their EEIs, the essential elements of information, all that documentation related to it. Once you've got a project that has all that together, in phase 2, it moves to phase 3, where the Consolidated Resource Center combs through it. And that's the objective. They're developing and validating the project's scope and cost, right? What it involved, the damage, and how much the repair, the reimbursement for that repair cost. The roles of the Consolidated Resource Center, they've got a bunch of different roles, just as a site inspector, task force leader, program delivery manager. Consolidated Resource Center has different roles itself. You've got the director, your task force leaders, lane task, like what lane are you? Stay in your lane? You've got a leader there to help you out. Validation, costing, developing or validating the cost. Just think of it. Say, if anybody's ever dealt with a category E, like a building, you've got your schools. That's an example I worked on when I was in the USVI. And the site inspector guy I was being trained by was pretty dang specific. You know, itemize everything. You've got so many ceiling tiles, so many floor tiles, so many panes of glass, so much in the way of light fixtures, so much in the way of lighting itself, what bulbs. Each one of those things has a cost associated with it. Our costing specialist can comb through that material and experience joy. Technical specialist, kind of the same idea. What if we are talking about something that is a mitigation effort? What if we are talking about something that now a road was damaged, was historic, something along those lines, but has to be brought up to code, right? You get the idea. The CRC's got people involved that understand what they're doing. Compliance manager, supervising that and helping out, especially with insurance. When we're talking about liaison, right? That communication factor, talking to, and here we have it, the hazard mitigation specialists, or those EHP, environmental and historic preservation. Should be emphasized as well that Consolidated Resource Center is speaking with a program delivery manager. If you've ever been involved with a project and seen an RFI request for information that might be related to something about mitigation, about EHP, about just simple fact that, hey, this document has this guy's social security number on it. You got to get rid of that. So just as the event's going to have a leadership structure, Consolidated Resource Center also has that structure. Again, we're talking about a team and not straight up hierarchy, but definitely who answers to who for what reason. it is laid out. So we're talking the Consolidated Resource Center has a completed lane lead, standard, specialized, standard versus specialized projects, document integrity, and then program compliance itself, making sure it's eligible, say that project, the damage, that applicant. So our next section, we're talking about public assistance eligibility and the national workflow. How that magic happens. What we've got here is one of my favorite snake charts, recently developed originally when they talked about the new PA, new public assistance, when they were putting together, standardizing, simplifying those roles, putting things into a new idea to help deliver those grants, get them toward obligation. Originally had 4 phases. Now you can see we have approximately 7. You can find this specific chart itself in Grants Manager. But this is just a clear explanation, a clear presentation of who, like this right here, the green for the applicants, the R in the light blue for recipients, and the orange for FEMA. Who does what in what part of the phase, what part of the flow? You have the incident, right? Your declaration occurs. You've got that PDA, your preliminary damage assessment. You get it actually declared. You start putting together with the recipient, applicants, get it all signed up, get applicants briefed, have them make the official request for public assistance so that they can move and start making sure that, hey, they are eligible. And where you find a lot of that eligibility, you can review your Papa G. You can talk often, with event leadership, disaster specific leadership. And then they go through your exploratory call, or if they're doing now a streamlined project application, SPA, that was developed almost entirely because of the COVID pandemic, allowing applicants to apply for COVID reimbursement by adding their information directly without the assistance necessarily of a program delivery manager, as well as going through recovery scoping meeting to here in phase 2 where you've got those inspections, the development of the DDD and those EEIs, getting together all that documentation, sending it on to the Consolidated Resource Center for scoping and costing, toward obligation, final reviews, etc. A fun chart. But here we're talking about the basic idea of building eligibility. At the very bottom level, the biggest level, is that applicant their self? Are they that entity? Is it a, say, privately owned school versus a public school versus whatever criteria may be for private ownership, for, again, PNPs, private nonprofit? What if they are for profit? What are those questions? Answering questions about eligibility there in phase 1 as the disaster is being set up, followed by what about the applicant's facilities? Using a school as an example, public school itself, the applicant, the building that the classes are held in, or one of the buildings on a larger campus, say public college, one of their campus-sized buildings. What does the work require? What needs to be repaired in that facility for that applicant? And finally, how much does it cost? You're assessing in a pyramid type. Before you move toward obligation, before all that costing and scoping, you've got to evaluate what was affected, what applicants were affected, how big the disaster was in general, what it accomplished, what time it happened in, what costs can the federal government assist with that are above and beyond what, say, the recipient and that applicant were able to afford because of the location and the severity of the disaster. And you have the steps that you've got to follow, including getting that request, the disaster be declared, that Stafford Act requirement, and then having those recipients follow through on their administrative requirements. Here we are, phase 1, pre-award activities, the preliminary damage assessment, PDA. Right? That's what's going on in my example being, since it's so recent, Tennessee. You request relief because it went above and beyond what you as an applicant were able to cover, what the recipient couldn't help with. Evaluate what went on, go through your administrative requirements, and here again, Who does what? Recipient. FEMA does some of the evaluation. But they're all together. Here's that team effort again. So just to summarize, pre-award activity, we're talking about how the incident impacts, how they're qualified in the preliminary damage assessment, doing your damage requests, your declaration requests, and getting those administrative requirements filled. Again, the idea, teamwork, talking about codifying who's representing the state, who's representing FEMA, what role they're playing, what they're looking at. And the SF 424 is a form that is added in Grants Manager at the event level, talking about who is what and why. So phase one, you're setting up disaster operations. You're reviewing FEMA's public assistance, determining that eligibility, starting to get to the bottom of it by checking out the impact of the disaster on applicants. Like, in other words, all right, you're to that school. It's a school. It's not a hospital. The hospital probably has a higher priority if it's really damaged than, say, the school itself. But the applicants, they're going to start making these assessments. The recipient is also, in conjunction with FEMA, you're starting to put together a structure of what to fix, when, and how, what's priority, so that as you're moving through phase one, briefing, getting that request for public assistance met, the applicant's doing that, making sure that applicant is actually eligible under those policies, those laws. Then you move on to the idea of applicant impact survey or the exploratory call, applicant impact survey, and moving to the recovery scoping video. We're talking about usually the streamlined process application, where the applicants can talk about mostly work that is completed, their category A, category B type of stuff, where they're able to go in after their request is approved for public assistance and start filling out the cascading logic of the form that'll ask them basically, who are you? Do you have insurance? How much it costs? Quick questions like that, and add through so that you can start moving into phase two. There he is. You got an applicant briefing. You request public assistance. You get that applicant impact survey filled out. You have the recovery scoping video either viewed or real meeting. Then you see here, the recovery scoping meeting, RSM, is held instead if PDMG is assigned. Otherwise, they're going through this process, they being the applicants, kind of on their own. But listen, those applicants will have been informed by a recipient, the people that helped set them up for this disaster. The recipient's going to have a point of contact to guide them through this process. And in a lot of cases, FEMA's helping out those recipients as well. Now in phase two, my favorite phase, what you're really doing is you're developing that list of impacts, that damage inventory, creating those line items. That damage inventory, those line items get assigned or put into projects. A program delivery manager is the guy who's going to formulate the projects. So when we were talking about that eligibility pyramid, we've gone from having the applicant now deemed eligible, and now that applicant is looking at some of their facilities, the actual structures or the areas that felt the impact of that disaster event. So that facility now needs to be deemed eligible. The damages that it incurred have documents associated with it, right? What, say, labor records, material costs, those are put into the EEIs, those essential elements of information. You're going to have the site inspections where applicable, right? Work to be completed. You definitely need to document, have that approved, have that documentation approved by the applicant and the applicant's representative to say that, yes, this is the damage that we are seeking reimbursement to repair. And you prepare that DDD, the damage description and dimension. That becomes part of the work eligibility, that third tier in the pyramid we had earlier. And then when they talk about routing projects for scope cost development, right, by gaining all this information, by getting that developed, you're moving from phase 2 toward phase 3 for scoping and costing. And there you've got the idea of how project lane assignments and site inspection requirements. Is the work completed? Boom. Sent to completed lane, no site inspection. Work completed, just as I was saying, say emergency protective measures, cones, traffic diversion, possibly just removal of debris out of that road. That's done. They've got receipts for the labor that was incurred, the time it took, etc. They've got documentation that they can quickly send forward, kind of like the low-hanging fruit idea for a program delivery manager. You want to get the work that is completed out of the way, get that reimbursement funding sent in a more timely fashion back to that applicant. But if the work is not completed, is it technical? If it's not, okay, if we're just talking about a washed out road where we've got sub base, some shoulders, some asphalt or concrete, whatever it may be, not necessarily complicated, as opposed to, say, a complex bridge, double-tiered bridge that's got structural problems with only one side. What do? Well, you need some technical specialists. Both of those, though, require site inspection to document exactly what was broken up, what was damaged, what approximate costs are associated with that based on the materials by which they need to repair. So phase 2, referring back to that snake chart that I'll show you where to find, we're talking about the damages, identifying what was broken up, putting it into a coherent type of form, making sure its eligibility, performing site inspections where needed, getting the documentation based on those damages, developing that DDD, kind of the spine of the snake there, that DDD. So you get the list in back, get the damage developed, right? The damage inventory. Put those damages into projects. Logically ordered, by the way. Category C's, probably different, obviously, than a category E. Hence the difference in categorizations. But you'll have projects in different categories. An applicant can have multiple damages, can have very simple damages. Ones that are more complex, you start to develop projects based on logical groupings. You get the scope, right? And the scope survey, what exactly of those damages was part of it. You get your documentation, those EEIs. And remember, when you're working in Grants Manager or Grants Portal, the way you start answering the questions right at the beginning starts the process by which Grants Manager can organize for you, kind of like cascading logic in a lot of ways. Answer A to B, for C or D, to go to E, F, G, or H, right? Get your site inspections done, develop that damage description and dimension, and follow your development guide. Make sure you get those questions answered because, again, scoping and costing coming up in phase 3 requires all of these to move efficiently toward obligation. Because as I mentioned earlier, Grants Manager and Grants Portal is the system of record. It's that repository that enables FEMA to basically trade documents for dollars. And in phase 3, after you get all that information put together, the objective of phase 3 is to develop, validate project scopes of work and cost estimates. They assess the scope of work and cost for eligibility, develop hazard mitigation proposal if eligible. You're conducting reviews. They showed all of the CRC different specialties, what lanes they were in. And EMI, this Emergency Management Mission Integrated Environment, that was a system of record that existed before Grants Manager Grants Portal was developed. It still exists because there are ongoing events, stuff from, say, 2015, 2014, where documentation and questions were similar to what was put together in Grants Manager and Grants Portal. Emmy is set for sunsetting sometime here in the next year or so. So they're moving things over, but you still in phase 3, you got to go through this step. And there it is. Scoping and costing, development validation, cost, and then some compliance. Summarizing phase 3, FEMA or applicant can develop scope of work and cost. The Consolidated Resource Center develops or validates them. Hazard mitigation proposals could be prepared, compliance reviews based on insurance and quality assurance, and then having those projects submitted into Emmy. Phase 4, toward obligation, toward getting that monies to our survivors. In this stage, phase 4, you're conducting those reviews for environmental and historic preservation. You're having the program delivery managers make sure that after phase 3, going through all the costs and scoping, applicants are comfortable with what was discussed, etc. FEMA itself goes through it. It's like you have people checking their checklists, making sure everybody is in agreement. You're gaining concurrence. You might hear that in site inspections. You are required as a site inspector to gain concurrence from the applicant or the applicant's representative. Basically, do you agree to what we're talking about here? Do you agree to these costs? Do you agree to those scopes? Do you agree about the description of the damage? And then you're able to, by going through applicants, recipients, FEMA, the people who are working there in the field, you can submit it. And that's the phase 4.
In phase 4, final project reviews with FEMA and the recipient are conducted, along with applicant signatures, where applicants digitally sign projects in Grants Portal. There are 5 steps in final reviews. First step, Environmental Historic Preservation Review, EHP. Step 2, PDMG Review, Program Delivery Managers. Step 3, FEMA Final Review, which is conducted by FEMA leadership. Step 4, Recipient Review. And then Step 5, Applicant Review and Signature.
Summarizing phase 4, you got EHP, you got the PDMG, you've got the Public Assistance Group Supervisor, again, concurrence, recipients, and applicants. First, you have FEMA making sure we did everything we were supposed to, and then we can show the applicants and recipients, hey, are we correct? Is this what we had been talking about through phase 1, through phase 2, through phase 3? And you get them to sign off. Moving into phase 5, finally, after getting all that concurrence from everybody, making sure all our T's were dotted, all our I's were crossed, we can obligate that project and transition the applicant, now the subrecipient, having gone through the grant process, you transition that relationship from the PDMG to the recipient in the region. In other words, the PDMG is now free to go to another applicant and do the same process. You get all that facilitated, this final thing, through the recovery transition meeting. Obligate funds to recipient recovery transition meeting. Everybody's in on that one. FEMA regions obligate projects. Recovery transition meeting facilitates the transition of the applicant from the PDMG to the recipient. Basically, handoff. And 6, now the applicant, who is a subrecipient, you're working toward completion. Making any adjustments, amendments, extensions, appeals, audits. As you can see, this process, which is supposed to be fairly quick, can take a while. I mean, here we're talking quarterly progress reports, amendments, extensions, appeals, audits. They're getting to it because going through this documentation, having this concurrence, making sure nothing was missed to help with this recovery, it can take some time, which brings up the whole concept of good communication can speed things along as well. Not just between team members and FEMA, but the relationships FEMA is able to develop with those recipients and with those applicants can really aid in the process. So subrecipients submit quarterly progress reports. They could have amendments. They may request an extension as they get more documentation based on whatever may be needed. And they can appeal some decisions, say based on eligibility. There are avenues in which we can help our survivors recover. But it's codified. You got to keep things transparent, which is another great thing about Grants Manager and Grants Portal. Information can be viewed from either side. Comments, history, who's changed what, notifications, all of that is part of Grants Manager and Grants Portal. And obviously, Department of Homeland Security's Office of the Inspector General, they make sure things are on the up and up. In phase 7, you're closing everything. You're making sure everything from the previous phases makes sense. There are no conflicts, extensions and appeals and amendments have been resolved, and you basically are pretty much done with it. Certifying, reconciling, closing those projects, telling the applicants, hey, it looks as though through that recovery transition meeting, all your projects have been certified and reconciled. And it looks as though we're able to close and grant that award. Subrecipients and recipients initiate project closeout, FEMA recipient closeout, subrecipients, FEMA recipient closeout, public assistance. So we went through those phases on that snake chart, how it goes through. This section, we'll talk briefly, quickly, about how you use Grants Manager and Grants Portal. There's the address for PA grants. That's Grants Manager. And they were talking about job aids. Same thing exists as resources as opposed to job aids in Grants Portal. This is the address for them. Step 1, click on it. Step 2, check out that section. Frequently asked questions is pretty good to go to. Feedback is where you can find the link to get to the change control tool for your CCT, those requests that you're able to submit to business architecture to go through not only questions or improvements you might think of for Grants Manager, Grants Portal, but also just stuff in general policy or related documentation. CCT link. Contacting us gives you the number for our hotline as well as the email box. So you could write a message to our hotline or you can call them directly. You can get that through here, that contact us. And of course, your account is like your profile within Grants Manager. Open up job aids. Applicant process is where you're going to be able to find, say, things, Grants Portal user manual. You see that they've got what they've got in there. Additionally, you can navigate. If you hit here up there at the table of contents, it opens up and gives you, instead of scrolling down through there, you can get to it directly. It's like an outline form. Grants Portal, same thing. Question mark, get into your resources. Frequently asked questions, same kind of thing. Feedback's going to take you to that idea of offering up some feedback, contacting hotline, etc. Here you go, training materials and resources. Here you've got that SharePoint, PA SharePoint that I was talking about. Those are the links. When I clicked that link, that new PA page, it took me straight to here. And in here, and what we've got is the ability to get here to your delivery toolbox in 3 different areas, Bango, Bongo, Bazongo, as well as getting to that change control tool to make those requests, to do those changes, either here or here. You have the ability to get to, and there's the original 4, remember, delivery model process. And you can check out sprints, what's related to those changes you did in Grants Manager right there. And a YouTube link, so it's kind of fun. Get to a station that has tutorials that are recorded, always added to it. It's a YouTube channel. But in the delivery toolbox, I go to it quickly. You can get information about the applicants. There's the applicant user manual. Keep on going down, but this is what they were talking about. Nora specifically mentioned this. So you can go to FEMA process. You got position guidance, process guidance. Within process guidance, honestly, that's where you can find the operations manual I spoke of earlier. Operations manual, a lot of fun. Obviously, it's being revised, as is everything. But this, when they had that one snake chart, this is a different type of flow chart talking about the phases. Who does what in those phases for FEMA. It's cool. I like that one. But that is in process guidance.
Next, Grants Manager Support Center.
By going here to support your support center, you can have your frequently asked questions. You can offer that feedback. CCT tool links in there. you can contact the hotline. You can get to job aids. And in job aids, under general resources, we've got training materials and tutorials. Just as I showed in the delivery toolbox, you can move on down to FEMA process. You've got all your laws, regulations, processes, all of these chock full of resources that you're also able to navigate by going to the menu, getting to it, training materials and tutorials, pop open. We've got here, you open that up, it goes to an Excel spreadsheet that has links, not just to the prepared YouTube channel presentations, but also to future trainings. And you can find immediately future trainings, as in like this week. This is updated Friday afternoons. And internal for us in FEMA, webinars talking about recipients and applicants get hit in there. And actually, I just wanted to show you quick. This is also an area where you can get those videos YouTubed. You can check out other presentations, such as this one that some slide decks are put in there, and COVID-19 training specifically. But for future trainings, immediately, you click on this, you open up that bad boy, and here you got it. Micro training schedules. Today, we had Grants Manager at 10 a.m. We also always offer Grants Manager access at 2 p.m. on Thursdays. And in between Wednesdays and stuff, we have different trainings. Tomorrow we'll have Program, Platform, and Process. And a good one to check out would be that exploratory call and the applicant impact survey we talked about in phase 1. But here, it explains what's going on, your link, and your password. And again, that is found by going right there, your support center. This is your task bell. I have an incomplete task. There you have it. There's OIG. If you or your team needs to report corruption, waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and misconduct, you've got the number. You've got the mail address. Procurement guidance. Great stuff to know. Be sure to call that hotline if you have technical questions. Be sure to reach out to myself if need be. You're free to go. Thanks again.